Oops. David, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, Tom. Thanks for having me here. So my name is David Fitzgerald, and in that I'm known at all, I'm probably best known for a series of books challenging the historicity of Jesus. Um, in 2010, I wrote a book called Nailed: 10 Christian Myths that show Jesus never existed at all. And then I did a follow-up book series called Jesus Mything in Action, a three-part series, and continuing with the same line of arguments. And like right out of the gate, I think the first thing I want to say is that it doesn't matter to me whether there was a Jesus or not. I don't have a dog in the hunt as far as my atheism. I was an atheism long before I ever thought there might not be a Jesus, and I'll be one if I change my mind tomorrow. And it turns out there was. But the interesting thing is, right about 22 years ago, um, I've got interested in trying to figure out who Jesus really was. Because again, it never crossed my mind that there might not be a Jesus. But when you start looking in the four Gospels, if you read them, you'll realize they're talking about four different people, and the personality of Jesus and the things he has to say and the things he does can change really radically from gospel to gospel. So, as a young atheist in 2000, I got really curious about which one is giving us the real Jesus, or are any of them giving us the real Jesus? Um, and so I started looking into that. And very long story, very short. About 2 years in that process, I started thinking, I'm beginning to think this guy didn't exist at all, full stop. And then I came across Will Doherty's books, started talking with Richard Carrier, and we started, you know, having these conversations saying, yeah, isn't this weird that this, isn't this weird that this? And sooner or later, it just, like I said in the book, once you start pulling on that thread, after a while, you've got no sweater. And that's where I am today. Oh,
Yeah. So what?
hold on, I've got somebody's phone is ringing.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
Happens to my phone too all the time. I like set a timer, an alarm for the debate when I'm supposed to wake up, and then I forget, and then it goes off in the corner. I have to go stop it. But so I was watching your interview with Derek on the 10 Christian myths, but you only got to 3 of them because you guys talk. So you have so much fun. You just only get to like a small portion. Could you tell us what the 10 Christian myths are? Because everybody
Sure.
loves the like bullet points.
Yeah, I'm glad I brought the book because I don't always remember which the 10 were myself.
Yeah, it's like remember the 10 Commandments. Christians can't remember that either for some reason.
Isn't it funny? Yeah. And the funny thing about this is, I should say, the Nailed book, the 10 Christian Myths, that was just like the introduction to the subject. And it's like pointing out the top 10 ways that just the Christian official story just fails. It just, whether there was a Jesus or not, this clearly means that the Gospels cannot be trusted about him. And I'll just run through the 10 super fast. The first is that the idea that Jesus was a myth was ridiculous. That's something they say right out of the gate, and it's like, yeah, that's just not true. And myth number 2 is that he was wildly famous, but then they immediately backpedal and say, but there was no reason for historians to take any notice of him at the time. Then they say, well, ancient historian Flavius Josephus did write about him. And it's like, no. Myth number 4 is eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. 5 is that they give a consistent picture of Jesus. 6 is that history, and 7, archaeology confirms the Gospels. 8 is that Paul and his epistles, and the other New Testament epistles, I should say, corroborate the Gospels. And 9, that Christianity began with Jesus and his apostles. And number 10, that it was totally new and wildly different from the religions that came before it.
Write those down.
Most of those are just pointing out how the official story doesn't hold up. The book I wrote after that, well, it's interesting. When I wrote that in 2010, I wasn't surprised that Christians hated it. That's nothing special. But I was surprised how many atheist critics jumped on my case and said, "Oh no, that's pseudoscience. That's like Holocaust denial. That's moon landing denial." And so I wrote a second set of book, which turned out to be a trilogy of 3 books, um, called Jesus, Mything in Action, where I give the positive arguments. Like, it's not just that it's an argument of silence over here, or that this couldn't have happened, but there was a Jesus in the back. It's like, this is how the Gospels will be different. This is how the rest of the Bible, the New Testament, would be different. And this is how first century Christianity would be different if there was just a guy named Jesus. And it points out all the problems with that and kind of responds to the critics of Nailed. And one of the most interesting things about that is when I wrote Nailed in 2010, I would get these critics who say, "Oh no, that's not true." In 2017, they would say, "Oh yeah, I never thought there was a Jesus." So it's like in those 7 years, um, it went from being no blasphemy to oh, this is that's nothing new here. Well, of course there wasn't a Jesus. So it's very funny.
Yeah, I have a I have a real interest in this topic because I think it's, from my perspective, I always think that Jesus existed because I think the default position in history is like that they exist until demonstrated otherwise. If anybody claims somebody existed, they probably
Yeah,
just existed until proven otherwise. I think that's like the innocent until proven guilty position in
yeah.
history.
And there's nothing wrong with that approach, but from a historical standpoint, we would never do that. All historical documents, all historical claims, all historical events, whether you're talking about the Bible or anything else, it's always, well, what's our evidence for that? And we put our trust provisionally in that according to the level of evidence. Um, and sometimes, I mean, that's just fine. Sometimes we'll never know for sure if there was a William Tell, for example, or if Julius Caesar really crossed the Rubicon, that kind of thing. But in most cases, we have at least enough information to make a provisional judgment on whether the default should be, no, I don't think there was a King Arthur, or yes, there was a King Arthur, but he was really this kind of figure over here. Um, and that's an interesting discussion to have, not with Christians, because I don't get myself involved with historicity debates with Christians because it's such a conversation stopper right out of the gate. But I'm happy to talk about it with atheists. And again, it doesn't matter to us whether there's a real Jesus or not. We don't need Jesus not to be a myth. It's the Christians who need him not to be a myth. And that's unfortunate for them because whichever side wins out, the historicist side or the mythicist side, either of those sides debunk the Christians' Jesus, the Jesus of faith, if you will. Um, and so that's why I like this debate, is because whichever side eventually triumphs, either one of those, uh, in the back and forth, we learn more about how much faith we should have in the Gospels, for instance, what we know about Jesus and what we can know about what he did and said. And it does not look good for him on either side. On either
But
side, yeah,
we had a comment from my friend Woody in the chat. He brings up William Shakespeare because I recently had a Shakespeare mythicist on my channel talking about that he thinks that
yeah,
Shakespeare was a pseudonym and he wasn't a real guy. And
yeah,
there seems to be a lot of these positions where historical figures can be doubted, and for good reason. Like there's lots of very good,
right,
intelligible arguments they make that Shakespeare wasn't a real guy that was actually named Shakespeare. But
right,
it's hard to say that like what is the level of criticism or skepticism we should have of these kinds of characters? Like we have nothing from Socrates, right? We have no writing of him
right.
whatsoever. It's all secondhand from Plato, but we still think he existed. And so what is the methodology that we can use in history in order to try to establish
Who
how
is
whether who is real, who is not, and
right,
whether we should
right,
believe someone who existed? And if we compare the Jesus mythicist case to like the Shakespeare mythicist case, what would be the
right.
differences?
Yeah, it's a great analogy, in fact. Um, with the Shakespeare situation, I don't have any expertise whatsoever to even make a judgment. But I find that the argument's really interesting that, oh, they think it was really Christopher Marlowe. Oh, they think it was really Queen Elizabeth. You know, on the merits of that, I don't know. But for when we're talking about an ancient figure, at least I have a better feel for um, when we should provisionally accept them. For example, John the Baptist. John the Baptist and Jesus, if you hold them up, John the Baptist has slightly better evidence historically than Jesus does, but not a lot. And so it wouldn't shock me if it turned out there was no John the Baptist either. I'd be surprised. Paul, everything we know about the Apostle Paul, half of them are written from, here goes that phone again. Um, half of them are written by the author of Luke, Acts, and they contradict everything we read about in Paul's genuine letters. And even Paul's genuine letters have obviously been re-edited, redacted, and probably are mashups of multiple letters turned into one letter. So when people say it's doubt if Paul was a real person, you can point to the fact that, well, everything we know about Paul seems to be coming from a very dodgy source. He at least is referring to historical events. So it feels too much of a stretch to me to doubt that Paul existed. But the Paul that we get is sort of a combination of fictitious and real, just like the portrayal of the apostles in the Gospels. We know there was guys named Peter. We know there was guys named Paul, and that the author of Mark, our oldest gospel, took names from Paul's letters and used them as the characters for his story. So he just took the names of the Jerusalem church leaders and put those in his lineup of apostles. Richard Carrier has written a book called Proving History, where he talks about the ways that we can sort through these issues and make a better argument on whether someone was real or not. And it's interesting when you do that for somebody like Jesus. The one thing you realize is that the Christian apologists out there who are saying, oh, well, he's as real as, if you throw him out, you have to throw everybody out. It's like, well, let's see what evidence we have for these other people, Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And in every single point for any of these props that we have propping up the history, physical evidence, written evidence, contemporary evidence, does it match what we know about that historical time? In all those ways, most of the people we run across have something in those boxes to check. Jesus, in 5 out of 6 of them, we have nothing. And the one we do have, written texts saying that there was a guy named Jesus, aren't the best kind, but they're anonymous, written obviously by guys who were not in the time or the place that the stories take place in. They're being passed off as eyewitnesses when they're clearly not. They don't even claim to be. It's like, and they're doing it to sell a new religion. It's like, we don't have the very best of that kind of evidence. We have the absolute worst of that category of evidence. And that's only one category out of many categories that we could look at to see if a person's real or not.
But is that sufficiently different from how any religion essentially starts? Because if we look at the accounts of Joseph Smith or whatever, and if we imagine we only had accounts from his followers and what they wrote, or people mentioning his followers, which is, I think, all we have of Jesus, would we expect to see anything different from that? Would we expect to see more? Or because it seems like all of the writings from followers of a religion seem to make up a lot of stuff, add in lots of exaggerations that don't fit the timeline whatsoever, but they're obviously exaggerations. They're just making stuff up. So it would make sense that they have some fitting into the time period, but then they make up stuff that has no basis in the time period whatsoever. So is there any sufficient difference between if he was a real person and we did only have writings from his followers, would we expect to see more than that?
And that's a really interesting question. The thing of it, again, we come back to the matter of how much evidence do we have to prop up that? Because, I mean, there's written texts about all kinds of things that happen in the ancient world. We could spend all day talking about that. But in the case of Joseph Smith, what I love about Mormonism is that we see all the smoking guns in his life. I mean, we know so much about his life. For starters, we have physical evidence from him. We have physical evidence of the people who knew him. We have physical evidence of his enemies, all these things. Now, the prophet Moroni, the angel Moroni, and the prophet Mormon, who wrote the Book of Mormon, that's a whole different thing. And then we're back into Jesus territory, because the history that they're giving, there's nothing whatsoever to support that. And if we only had the Book of Mormon, for instance, and it's 1,000 years in the future or so, we wouldn't really know anything at all about Joseph Smith, the author / translator of the Book of Mormon. But we could know that the Book of Mormon was not true just because the archaeological claims it makes and how we know archaeology played out. And if we had a
So,
copy of the Bible, we'd be able to see, oh, this is clearly fan fiction from this other religious writing.
but we don't have most people back then have nothing. Like we don't have historical documents mentioning the vast majority of people, and
Sure,
so having anything at all seems to be better than the vast majority of people who we grant existed back then,
sure.
because most of them have nothing written about them.
And
And
that's a
so
great point. And I'll just back up slightly to say there's nothing implausible about there being a real Jesus. Um, but I like what Robert Price says about it. It says, for all intents and purposes, even if there had been an actual figure in the first century, just another failed apocalyptic Messiah, for all intents and purposes, there isn't one anymore because everything we think we know about him comes from 4 biographies, and those 4 biographies are based on the first biography, and that first biography looks like it's 100% allegory from start to finish, taken from the Jewish scriptures and created this Frankenchrist out of scriptural scraps in a collage. So it's really fascinating. And there's a lot of other figures like Apollonius of Tyana, who seem to be created out of that same prospect, that same process rather. Um, but we don't have nobody really worries about whether that was a real person or not because no one's ever heard of him for the most part. Um, but Jesus, it's funny because the things that get said about him by biblical scholars would never get said about any other ancient figure. And the things that get done in biblical studies and Jesus studies, they would never get away with them in any other field or subfield of ancient history.
I would
Um,
like to ask about those, but I also first like to ask, what is the minimum criteria for Jesus having existed? Because obviously there's lots of embellishment in the stories. As
right,
atheists, we don't think he did any of the miracle stuff, no rising from the
right,
dead, but there's like some minimum set of facts, a minimal facts approach, if you will, that Jesus
right.
existed. And what do you think that would be? Like for me, it's like ancient Roman Jew who was crucified by the Romans named Jesus. That's about like if those things are true, and he had preached
Yeah,
and followed his gospels. As long as those facts are true, I'd probably grant there was a human named Jesus who fits this character.
right. Part of the problem with that is, I mean, let me back up. That's not a bad approach. It's not, in fact, that's kind of how I approached mythicism. Because again, I didn't start out as a mythicist. I wanted to know what was the real Jesus. And in that process of winnowing out, well, that's obviously not true. That's obviously not true. I realized that I was pulling the props out of what we could possibly know about this person. Um, and when I realized that his only biography that survives is clearly allegorical, that was a problem. And when I realized that when you look at early Christianity, Christianity before that book was written and Christianity after that book was written are extremely different. Um, After the Gospels are written, Christians, at least in the New Testament, they start talking about Jesus the way our preachers talk about Jesus. They say, Jesus said this, Jesus said that, blah, blah, blah. But when you read Paul's letters, and not just Paul, but all the Christians before him, like the author of the book of Hebrews, they never talk about Jesus as if he's a real person. And they go on these long, bizarre tangents that would be really weird to explain if they knew what Jesus actually said and did. So we're left
Which books
with
are those
this.
that you're referring to that don't
I'm talking
refer
about
to
the letters
Jesus?
we have, the genuine letters of Paul, and the other parts of the New Testament that are supposedly written by by friends and family of Jesus. We'll put it that way. They're obviously forgeries, and they're obviously written long after the fact. But the book of Hebrews and the genuine letters of Paul, they talk about a Jesus who's a celestial figure. They don't talk about somebody who used to live, um, and they don't seem to have any knowledge of his uh, his disciples. Paul never uses the word disciples ever in any context, let alone says that Jesus had any of them. He is got all these weird. They call the silence of Paul that he seems uninterested in Jesus's life because he never refers to it, and he never reminds people what Jesus said or did, even when he's reminding his flock what Paul said and did. Um, and there's only 1 or 2 points that historians can even grab from the letters of Paul, And when you look at them, and it's things like he was born of a woman, which already, who talks like that about anything except a demigod, for starters? But even when you read the context of that passage, he's, for one thing, it says he was made of a woman, not born of a woman in the Greek. And he's talking about this hypothetical argument about how if we are this allegory of if we're born under Abraham's wife Sarah, we're under the law. If we're born under his slave wife Haggai, we're not. And so anything that they point to is saying, "Oh, look, Paul knew Jesus." Even the Bible itself says Paul didn't know Jesus. So
Right, but does that mean, wouldn't that make it not so surprising that he would write about Jesus as a celestial figure, because that would be the only interaction he had was when Jesus came down and is like the celestial form for Paul?
right, and the thing is, at this same time, supposedly, we've got all these other figures who knew Jesus. We don't have any of their writings. We've got writings for people who forged their names long after the fact, and even when they quote Jesus, they're only quoting from the Old Testament. Everybody pitches back to the Old Testament when they talk about what Jesus said or did. Even early church leaders like Clement, when he quotes what the Lord said, he's quoting Jesus from the Old Testament, nothing from the Gospels. So there's all these
Wait,
weird.
what do you mean by that? So like when
Well, what I
Jesus
mean is, like,
says,
he says,
when he's on the
yes,
cross
as
and he
our,
says, Lord, you have forsaken me. Is that a reference to the Old
yeah,
Testament?
that's exactly, that's a perfect example. That's taken from the opening of the 21st Psalm. Um, and Clement does that in other examples too, and other Christian writers do as well. Um, and there's things like, even just the thought of as you try to like reduce the bare bones list of, well, this, at least he must have done this. And this is what I went through before I became a mythicist. The fact that the Romans crucified him is a huge problem, because historically, the way that's presented, nothing makes sense at all. It's like, no, Jews would never have done that on the eve of the Passover. They wouldn't have done that. They couldn't have done that. You couldn't have the high priest acting like a prosecuting attorney, because Jewish trials didn't have prosecuting attorneys at all. Things like that. And then when you read the Barabbas narrative, where punches Pilate because he's such a nice guy, he gives the Jews their choice of releasing this notorious murderer or their beloved king of the Jews who just showed up in town to claim of everyone. And they, for some reason, choose the vicious anti-Roman murderer and call for Jesus' death instead. Makes no sense logically, historically, plot-wise. And yet, as an allegory, when you realize, oh, Barabbas in Aramaic means son of the Father. So you've got two sons of the Father, one who's perfect and sinless, and one who's filled with sin, covered in sin, sins of sedition, sins of murder. But he's allowed to be released and go off unharmed, while the perfect one is crucified, sacrificed as a sin offering for Israel. Jewish scholars recognize that this whole everything that takes place in the story is an allegory for Yam Kippur. And that was one of the things that, when I realized that, it just kind of blew my mind. It opened up everything, because everything Jesus does and everything he says in that first gospel is an allegory for something that happened in Jewish history. The words he speaks, the things he does, the things like him getting mad at a fig tree because it's out of season. It's like, that doesn't make any sense at all. But when you say, oh, the fig tree is Israel and it didn't bear fruit, and that's why Jesus is turning his back on it, and now Christians are the new fruit, if you will. All those weird stories that make no sense make perfect sense as an allegory. And again, that was just the first book. Mark was, and his Jesus is the most no frills, low rent Jesus we have. When you have Matthew come later and Luke come later, they like that book, but they want to improve on it, because you see Matthew like correcting Mark's mistakes, like his citations of Jewish scripture or his misunderstandings of basic Judaism 101. Mark makes all kinds of mistakes like that. Matthew corrects them. Luke follows them. So we know Luke probably wasn't a Jew either.
Well, question about that really quick. So
Yeah.
if Jesus was a real person and was crucified,
Yeah.
obviously that's bad for the people who follow it. That's like, this is a very,
Yeah.
our leader was just killed by the Romans. And so
Yeah.
if it did happen, wouldn't you expect them to add in some kind of meaningfulness to the narrative to try and make sense of it? And so all of these things of making it fit Yom Kippur and the Jewish people and adding all these fictional things like Barabbas, which, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think that doesn't make any sense. Pontius Pilate
Yeah.
doing this, having all of that stuff makes no sense. But adding that stuff in to something that is drastically bad for their ideology seems like that would make sense. So is
Yeah.
that
But
a
here's the thing about that.
justification for denying the crucifixion at all?
Well, here's the thing. It's when if it makes perfect sense, and I certainly was the argument I used to hold that this is obviously all cognitive dissonance that they came up with, and there's still um, biblical scholars out there who say, yeah, maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. We can accommodate, we can account for the rise of early Christianity, whether that happened or not, and that's an important thing to make as well. The thing with the Jesus story and his crucifixion and his career and what he taught and what he said is like all those could be add-ons to a real Jesus who really existed. But the problem is, where do we see that real Jesus in the Gospels? Where's that kernel of truth? Because I said and nailed that the one thing that really puzzled me is if you take out all the stuff that's clearly not didn't happen, you're left with a figure who no one would really care about. And so, on the one hand, we've got this guy who did all these amazing miracles, or at the very least, taught all these amazing, radical new things. And yet, for about 100 years or so, no one outside his tiny cult seems to know about him, or take notice of what he did, or take notice of what he taught. And at the same time, as soon as he's dead, you've got all these feuding little houselets, not just in Judea, not just in Galilee, but spread all over the Roman Empire, tiny little cultlets of him that can't seem to agree on anything, the basics of his life, like whether people are risen from the dead or not. That seems to be a weird argument for early Christians to be having, and yet we know that they were having that. And so that paradox alone was kind of what I pinned nailed on, and I had a chapter in there called "Can Jesus Be Saved?" and where I point out all the
Have you
ways that
have
things
you
would be different if there had been just an ordinary guy named Jesus.
well, have you checked that with other religions? Because I know there's a great deal of disagreement in Mormonism about the starting of Joseph Smith,
Well,
and with Santi Sai Baba in Hinduism, and with Buddha. It seems
I
like there's always a great diversity of people. Muhammad was a great example because there's all those different
I
Qurans, and Abu
I am
Bakr.
so glad you asked that, because one of the weirdest side effects of me getting into the Jesus historicity thing 22 years ago was how often Buddhists would come up to me and say, yeah, we're having the same debates in our circles about whether the Buddha existed. And ex-Muslims coming up to me and saying, yeah, we're having the same debates in our circles whether Muhammad existed or not. And this was like well into the 2010s for me. So it's like, I never thought that Muhammad couldn't have been non-existent either, because we've got his family tree, we've got this, we've got these wars that started. And then they started telling me why. It's like, well, yeah, but our evidence for that doesn't start until like 100 years later. So that was a thing that really blew my mind. And last year, I did a talk for the Global Center for Religious Research on the historical Jesus. And one of the things I brought up, or wanted to bring up, was that Buddhists are having the same circle problems, Muslims are having the same things. And so what I did before I went to the talk is I better just check all the top 10 to see if any other religious figures are in that same boat. Tom, guess how many other religious figures of the major world religions are in that boat?
All of them.
Every single one of them. Every single one. All the top 10. Even Sikhism, which is barely 500 years old, it starts with this family tree of the 10 gurus, and all the history seems to start with guru number 5 a couple hundred years after the fact. So that blows my mind. That's the book I'm working on right as we speak, is talking about the evolutionary stages that all the major world religions seem to go through, and how, by the way, doesn't have to be this way, but this is how it is anyway. It seems like all of their founder figures are made up. It blows my mind. Blows my mind.
Well, I would go the other route. I'd say that I would say that even though a large portion of the narrative around the character was made up, the character probably was a real person. So same with Jonathan Smith. There's lots of conflicting stories about his life where we have actual historical documents of him being in jail. So we have a really reliable
Oh, sure.
story of his life. But
Yeah.
there's
And
equally as much like fighting in Mormons about what his real life was like, but we still think he existed. And so the fact that there
sure.
is this infighting, I don't think is a good reason to conclude they're all myths, but mostly that the religious people have these emotionally justified reasons to interpret the text in such a way that's beneficial to
For
them.
sure. For sure. And again, it's no skin off our backs if all these people were real. But when you have religions that aren't even sure what century their founder figure lived in, these aren't the closing arguments. These are the opening arguments. It's like there's a red flag here, and we should look into this. And I encourage everybody to look into all these religions, and that's what the point of my next book is going to be. And it seems churlish to even point out that, well, we know all religions are fake. Yeah, that's not special. We know that. But the level that all of them seem to go through, their evolutionary similarities, that's what I find fascinating about it. And when I read like Christian evangelical scholars having the same kind of historical arguments about, say, Zoroaster as they do about Jesus, and I see them using the exact same emotional responses and the same defensive postures. It's fascinating to me to see that people with no dog in the hunt still go to that place where it's like, oh, no, 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 there was a real guy. And we know this is true because it says it right here in this book here. The napkin religion is true because it says right here in the napkin. Um, and again, and I feel like I constantly have this argument with atheists. It's fine if we think there was a historical core to these people. What I'm arguing is that if we want to look into what that historical core looks like, generally we find that that kernel of truth, we have no way of knowing what that kernel of truth was because there's just not enough evidence to support us saying anything left or right, what this person was like. And that's true whether the religion is true, that's true whether this person was true or not. It's just everyone should be an agnostic. I make a joke in one of the books that everyone should be a militant agnostic about Jesus. It's like, no, I don't know if there was a real Jesus, and neither do you.
Yeah, I totally empathize with what you were saying earlier that they use the same methodological approach to justify their beliefs. Like I think that's
Yeah,
just a part of human nature. Like
sure.
using certain kinds of fallacies and biases and illusions and delusions are just
Yeah,
inbuilt in humans. Hyperactive agency detection system, cognitive
yep.
biases, Dunning-Kruger, all the things. I think that it's just
That
innate
whole
in humans.
suite of cognitive dissonance. Yep,
Things
absolutely.
people think are rational but aren't. It's like
Yes, yes, and it speaks to me about how these are when you look at like what religion was like 40,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, um, you see everybody, regardless of whatever gods or god they're worshiping at the time, they're all kind of doing it in broad strokes the same way. Um, and we can tease out how all the religions are different and every religion is different. They're just like precious snowflakes that way. But in a bigger picture, when you look at their evolution, they all evolve much the same. The dogmas are always different, the gods are different, the rules are different, and yet the way that societies arrive at these things are all amazingly similar, for better and for worse.
we had a super chat from Marty Mad Scientist. Is there academic support for the idea that Jesus myths were intentionally developed to appease the slave population?
Um, I wouldn't say there's academic support. There's definitely fringe mythicist theories out there that say, "Oh, the Romans invented it all." Um, Joseph Atwell's kind of notorious for that, and he's not the only one who makes that kind of argument. But all of them seem to flounder for me because if you're smart enough to concoct that Christianity really started much later, almost 100 years in the case of Josephus, and that we can tell that because the subtle clues that he makes, that the gospels are supposed to be these very, very subtle, very satirical takes on it, and it was all written by the Romans to make Christianity its social black ops, it's crowd control. None of that matches what we know about history of the first century and the second century. If anything, Christianity is probably older than what we have, and that there was probably some kind of it came out of the mystery faiths, and there was probably earlier, the further we go back, the roots go further back. But to ignore a whole century or more of Christian history and the evolution of that, and to try to say that this was all just planned by the Romans Christians weren't even on their radar until like the 3rd century or so. The earliest Roman reference we have to Christians is in the 2nd century, and it's saying something to the effect of, it's like the attorney general of the Roman Empire saying, yeah, we found this cult here called the Christians. I've never heard of these guys. Have you heard of these guys? What should we do with these guys? Makes no sense if anything in the New Testament was true about the incredible spread of Christianity. It seemed like it took centuries for it to even get to the level of minor cults. And if Roman history had gone differently in the 3rd century, we wouldn't be talking about Jesus. We'd have this argument about Mithra or any number of other deities right now.
So what would your minimum facts be for if these set of facts were true, you would grant Jesus was a real person?
Well, here's the thing. The minimum facts for an early cult of Christianity is much stronger than the minimum facts of anyone you want to point to as the founder figure. And I'm including John the Baptist in that too. It seems to me, I agree with those who argue that Christianity, as we see it at the earliest stages, it looks like a mystery faith. It looks like a Jewish version of the Hellenistic mystery faiths that we see in the 2nd century BC, the 1st century BC, the Hellenistic period. That's where it seems to me that Christianity gets started, not much later, and as some kind of artificially constructed social control.
Well, I mean, so if there was a person named Jesus, what facts about his life would need to have been the case for you to grant, oh no, Jesus mysticism was wrong, this guy did exist, he was real?
Right. Well, it'd be nice to have physical evidence from any of this. It'd be nice to have writings from him on any of this. It'd be nice to have anyone who was actually a eyewitness to that say that they were eyewitness to that and not be a forgery hundreds of years later. It's very weird whether Jesus was real or not, whether Christianity is true or not. It's very weird that for the first 100 or so years, they only decided to keep letters from one guy, basically, Paul. And it's like, that's a strange thing. And it's one of those things that makes the people who argue that Paul was just a figure constructed in the 2nd century by Marcion or someone like that, it gives a little more weight to them. But I suspect in the case of Paul, there's enough historical data in those letters that we can at least know that there was some missionary group named Paul, and he had other rival missionaries, and they were all kind of in the same boat. Reading what for instance, what Paul considers a person who's a real apostle is, and what a false apostle is really fascinating. Reading his interactions with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, if those guys were supposed to be the friends and family of Jesus, you would never know it by reading Paul, because he acts like they're not real Christians. He says, I don't know who these guys think they are. He opposes Peter face to face. It's kind of fascinating to me.
You also, earlier you mentioned things that apologists get away with when applying history to the Jesus story. Could you list some things like that they wouldn't get away with in other historical contexts?
Yeah, there's a lot of circularity that you get. And there's a lot of things like, let's find the minimal facts that we know happened with Jesus. And then they go to the Gospels, and you just get a laundry list of what the Gospels say. But you don't get any kind of historical. Can I give you this, baby? This has been going off constantly.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. You don't get any historical backing for any of these things, mostly because in the case of this, there's no physical evidence to be had. There's no eyewitness accounts to be had. There's a real gap that they take in stride and act like, oh, it's no big deal that we have none of this. And it's like, well, maybe it's not that big a deal, and maybe it's not, implausible. Maybe he was just one more loser Messiah of the 1st century, of which we know there were plenty of them. But that doesn't do you any favors. It's Bart Ehrman did a debate recently, and he's, as we all know, he's a very famous historicist who was sure there was a guy named Jesus. But the debate wasn't on that. It was, can we trust the New Testament on the historical Jesus? And when I was reading that book, it felt like I was talking. We were all exactly on the same page about why we cannot trust our biographical sources for Jesus. And in the case of Jesus, that's all we've got. Our physical uh, witnesses are even our textual witnesses for Jesus. For the most part, they're not talking about Jesus. They're talking about early Christianity. And we believe they were Christians. We just think they started in a different way than Christians do. And I think that's true whether you're talking about secular historicists or secular mythicists. Both of us agree that the Christianity we get presented to us in the Bible just doesn't hold up. And so we know that's not how it started.
Yeah, so I wanted to go through some of the 10 myths that you mentioned. The last
Yeah,
one you said was Christianity began with Jesus. Well,
yeah.
that's like pretty like cut and dry. Like, well, that's what Christianity is, right? To worship Jesus. How could it begin before Jesus?
Well, when you get, for instance, the book of Hebrews is a New Testament book, but it's not talking about a Jesus who was born of a virgin and a married, stable, had this career over here in Judea, did all these things in Jerusalem. Everything he does is on the heavenly stage. He's a heavenly high priest who does all this. He compares him to Melchizedek, the mysterious Old Testament figure, and says, like him, he has no history. He has no mother or father. He just kind of appears. Um, and we think that what they were saying in the book of Hebrews is a lot like what Paul and the Christians of his generation, those ones who were preaching, they were preaching a Jesus who speaks to them through the Hebrew scriptures. And everything they say that they know about Jesus comes from their study of the scriptures and from personal revelations, dreams and visions that appeared to them. Um, so just even scraping at what they're really getting at the real Jesus behind this, we don't need a real Jesus for that. We need a celestial figure like we see in books like the Ascension of Isaiah, a very early Christian writing, like we see in any number of other mystery faiths where they're talking about Mithras slaying the bull, but really what they're talking about is an astronomical phenomenon, and this is all a myth encoding all that. And we
Well,
see
could you
that
give me
in
an
early
example of
Christianity.
a quote in Hebrews that you could say, this is the start of Christianity, but is excluding Jesus or doesn't include Jesus?
Well, everything about that, there's no point where Jesus is on earth in the book of Hebrews. In fact, there is a verse saying if he was on earth, he would be this kind of a priest, or we wouldn't need him because we have these kind of priests. So, I mean, right from the beginning, there's no connection between an earthly Jesus. When you look at Paul, Paul not only disagrees with Jesus sometimes, but when he's quoting things that Jesus said, he's never saying Jesus said this. Or if he does say something, he'll say, the Lord told me that, but we don't know if he's talking about the Lord God or the Lord Jesus, because nothing that he says in those things are anything we find in the Gospels either. Um, and again, Paul says things like, when the Lord comes, this will be happening, and the Lord's going to come very soon, blah, blah, blah. He never talks about the Lord coming back. There's no indication this was a second coming. Um, and even in the things that seem to be the closest he gets to referring to a physical historical event, like say the Lord's Supper, he talks about that as if this is something that came to him, uh, from Jesus himself, um, talking about the night that the Lord was delivered up. Um, and he says things like, um, well, he acts as if though no one would know this story unless he's telling it to you for the first time now. And there's multiple things weird about this, and I talk about like the the Greek of what he's saying, but the one of the weirder things about it is that Christianity is not the first real Lord's Supper. All the pagan mystery faiths had Lord's Suppers or Ladies' Suppers for their pagan gods. I feel like I had three rabbit holes I was about to go into during this one question, and I haven't. Um, so you keep talking and see if anything else comes back to me.
Well, yeah. So I wanted you mentioned that Paul doesn't corroborate the Gospels as well, like the ninth
Yeah.
myth. And you brought that up a little bit in answering this one. Why do you say that? What do Christians mean when the Christians say that Paul corroborates the Gospels, and how are they wrong?
There's many ways that they say, oh, well, Paul clearly knew the guys who knew Jesus, even though he never claims that they have any kind of uh, connection to Jesus, and he certainly doesn't act like they have any special connection to Jesus. In fact, again, he doesn't think they're real Christians. He thinks they're he looks at them very dodgy, and he opposed Peter. That alone kind of blows my mind. But Paul also says things like, "We preach a Christ who's crucified," and that's to the Greeks foolishness and to the Jews a stumbling block, because the Greeks look for wisdom, wise teachings. The Jews look for miracles. So
Wait,
why would
you
he
said
say that?
Paul doesn't consider the other Gospels real Christians? Is that
Well,
what you said?
he doesn't consider the leaders of the Jerusalem church, who we think of as, oh, that's James, that's Jesus' brother, that's Peter, that's Jesus' number one disciple. He says nothing like that. Where not even to like defend himself against opposing them. He just doesn't think. He thinks they're just one more group of Christians like he is, like Apollos of Alexandria, or any other number of these rival preachers he has to deal with. He never acts like he has an advantage over them, or they have an advantage over him that he needs to explain away. So again, it's just one more example of all these. Well, that's a weird thing to say if Jesus was this. When he talks about the early church and the hierarchy of the early church, like at the top are the apostles, at the lower are the deacons, all this down. Friends and family of Jesus don't even appear on his, even though he should have known who Mary was, he should have known who Peter was, he should have known these guys weren't just the leaders of the Christian church, but they were the family of Jesus. He never says anything remotely like that, or and not just him, but any of the forgeries written under his name, generations later. They don't mention it either. Uh, Christianity before Mark's gospel comes out talks about Jesus in a completely different way than they do after it.
So could you give an example of something Paul says which would not corroborate the other Gospels?
Um, well, there's things that he says that later we see in the gospels Jesus saying, but when Paul says them, he's not saying, as Jesus said, blah, blah, blah. He's just making, giving his teachings. Some of those, not all of them, and some of the opposite come into the Gospels as words of Jesus. So we can see that Mark, that first Gospel writer, whatever his real name was, it wasn't Mark, is taking names from Paul's letters and taking teachings that he likes from Paul's letters. And the same guy, Luke, whoever Luke really was, when he wrote Acts, he did the same thing with Peter. For instance, he has that vision where Peter has a vision of God saying him, oh yeah, everything is, don't worry about kosher now. You can eat whatever animals you want. Well, in the Gospels, Jesus already said that decades ago. So it's like, why was there the need to do this? It's because these teachings didn't exist yet. They didn't exist until the Gospels came around.
Gotcha. And what was there was three you mentioned right before the 5, 6, and 7, which were like historical. I wrote down consistented, which isn't the
Oh
word.
yeah. Well, let's see what it was. Myths 5, 6, and 7 where the Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus, and that's an interesting conversation to be had, because when you take the first Gospel, Mark, and the last Gospel, John, boy, howdy, are they not talking about the same guy? Mark is like this secret Jesus that says, don't tell anyone where I touched you. It'll just be our little secret. And he is actually going out of his way to make it seem like Jesus told everyone he did miracles for, now don't tell anybody. Shh, we'll figure this out later. And like the women run from the tomb and didn't tell anyone. And that's how Mark's gospel originally ended. And the silly women run from the tomb and didn't tell anyone. And that's why you've never heard this story until today, is the implication. John, his Jesus, not only does he start out right from the beginning as being right there at creation and one part of the Godhead, but the words that come out of his mouth is like, was there a shortage of rocks in that part of John's story? Because he would have been stoned for blasphemy right out of the gate. He acts like he's got a big T-shirt saying, I am God, and doesn't care who knows it. And nothing in his story makes sense. And that's even when you get away from him gratuitously adding a new character called the beloved disciple, who's supposed to be the real author of the Gospel of John. John is not the Gospel's author in the book of John. That is the beloved disciple, the disciple who Jesus loved the best. And he is inserted in all the other stories that we get from the other Gospels. It's so weird because, like, in the other Gospels, Peter runs the tomb. Well, in this story, Peter and the beloved disciple run to the tomb, and the beloved disciple beats him. It's like he's constantly one-upping the other disciples with this character who was obviously just inserted into their stories. And that's just for the stories that they bother to match up with. I mean, if you just take the solid historical information from the Gospels, they don't add up at all when you take the first three Gospels and John's Gospels. And people who talk about, but the levels of detail. Go ahead.
What is this the beloved disciple? Where is that? Like, if I'm looking at the King James version, what is the beloved disciple? How do I find that from?
You'll find this character starts popping up. I think he first appears around when the Passion stories start. So like the Last Supper, for sure, he's in there. I think that's when we first start hearing about him. But it's weird to read the stories that he tells in John and then read them in the original stories, because it's like a time traveler popped in and is hanging around with George Washington or somebody. It's like he sticks out, and yeah, it's wild. But just on a sheer timeline, if you just take the description of what John says happened in the last month of Jesus and the description of what happened in the last month from the other Gospels, not that they always line up either, but they're not even trying to match up. John has, in the other Gospels, for instance, he cleanses the temple. He kicks out all the moneylenders. Huge, spectacular mess. Historically, could never work because, like, the Romans are right there. But that's what gets Jesus in trouble. And a week later, he's executed that week. John, that's how he starts off his Jesus' career 3 years earlier. That's the first thing he does. And when he gets in trouble, it's because he's raised Lazarus from the dead, and the Jewish leaders, everyone knows about it so much. It's like, it's such a huge thing that they can't deny it. It's like, oh, we have to kill him now. Makes no sense at all, because Lazarus, the character, doesn't even appear in the other Gospels, unless you count a parable that Luke gives. It's the name of a fictional character in there. It's wild.
Got a super chat from
weirdness. Michael. Oh yeah.
He said, David, are you still doing a JW book? What is JW?
Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses. In theory, I am, but I wanted to do the sex and violence in the Bible book first. And then last year, this business about the evolutionary stages and the fact that all the founder figures in world religions seem to be fake took precedent over that. So in theory, I am still working on the JW book, but it's on the back burner. But to be honest, I did a book on the Mormons, and the Mormon book was so much fun because there's just so much wild craziness in Mormonism to uncover. And I feel like I just did scratch the surface, just the tip of the iceberg. And it still was a huge book packed full of stuff. JW's, for one thing, it's such a sadder and more depressing story. There's no exciting Wild West adventures. There's nothing. It's like a Sunday school that went really, really toxic and Soviet and Stalinistic and very depressing. And I don't know that I would bring as much to that that hasn't been done by other authors right now who were raised in the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm blanking on their names right now, but Lloyd is the one I'm thinking of. If I think I can really bring in some new, fresh approaches to it, I will go back to that. And I know a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses are really chomping at the bit for me to write it. But give me a little time to finish these and see if I can really come up with something decent that's worth writing about them. Yeah, gotcha. Long-winded answer to say maybe.
So after consistency was history. Something about history was the sixth one? Sixth?
Yeah, let's see. We've got 6 was history confirms the Gospels, and 7 was archaeology confirms the Gospels.
Yeah, so talk about
And
those two. So
yeah,
uh,
let's do.
there was no global flood. What?
Well, it's things like when we were talking about Barabbas, that everything about his historical trial, they're like, and this is something interesting because even Bart Ehrman points this out, and it's true not just of all the other reconstructed historical Jesuses, but it's true about his own Jesus was just a failed apocalyptic prophet. He says most of them, including his, don't make sense of the fact that the Romans would give a rat's ass about any of this, including his and including the Gospels. The Gospels don't do a very good job of explaining why the Romans would care about it, because they wouldn't. And if Jesus was on trial for blasphemy, they would have taken him out and stoned him. The Jews would have, and that would be that. But the thing is, it's not blasphemy to call yourself the Messiah in Judaism. In the first century, they were doing it. In the second century, they were doing it. There's no law against that. Everybody who, all these messiahs we saw in the first century were doing that. So it's like the very logic underpinning all these things shows that that story was written by somebody who doesn't understand Judaism very well. And Matthew goes out of his way to try to correct the mistakes that Mark makes doing that. But the story still doesn't hold up. And we're just left with that. Just like we're left with two different nativity stories who don't connect at all. Matthew's and Luke's, none of those things can be together. And yet, every year at the Sunday school Christmas special, they can manage to blend those two stories in a mashup. But when you read them separately, there's no point of connection at all. At all. And of course, Mark doesn't even bother with a nativity story.
So what about archaeology? Because I've never heard the claim that there was archaeological evidence that could actually correspond to Jesus, except maybe like Joseph's tomb or something. Some like very
well.
fringe.
I mean, there is a lot of that. There's a lot of quasi archaeology. Like, look, here's a tomb. It's empty. Therefore, it's like that's kind of ridiculous. Mostly, I was talking about in the archaeology part are textual evidence, like the earliest manuscripts we have of the New Testament. And the thing about that is, and again, this is one of those things that comes out, whether Christianity is true or not, whether there was a real Jesus or not, these are the facts as we have them. For the first 150 to maybe 200 years of Christianity, we have nothing to corroborate our Gospels. We only have tiny little fragments about the size of a postcard, a credit card. Yeah, here's a picture one. This, when I wrote the book Nailed, is P52. That was considered the oldest manuscript of the New Testament. It's dated from 125 to about 175, or at least, or so we thought. So when you hear Christians talk about this, they invariably say, "Oh, here's P52, the oldest collection of Mark. It dates to 125 or even younger." It's like, no. When I read what the actual papyrologists, the ones who study the actual physical text of it, none of them ever said anything about it being as young as 125 to 175. That's just something that apologists picked up and ran with. They think actually it's very late 2nd century to 3rd century, which means not only is that not the oldest manuscript we have of the Bible, but the oldest manuscript we have of the Gospels is from a heretical, extra-canonical gospel that's not in our Bibles. So it's just one of those many Christian writings, early Christian writings, that weren't part of our Christianity, that weren't part of our Bible, showing that they were more out there. So my point is, and again, we act like that is a witness for this thing the size of a credit card is the witness for the book of John. That's like 18 words from the book of John. And the only complete word in that is the word "and." So it's like, this isn't even a complete witness of those verses that it's talking about. When we get complete books of the New Testament, we're talking hundreds of years later, like 200 or 300 years. And we're talking about complete New Testaments. We're talking about 500 years, the year 400 or so. And the interesting thing about that, we have two of those, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. They have books we don't have. We have books they don't have. They don't match each other. They don't match our New Testaments. So it's the closer you look at what our textual evidence is for the Bible, the dodgier it gets. And to bring it back to the opening question of that is, for the first 150 to 200 years, we have nothing. We have no idea what the original documents looked like, what Paul really said. And if they were magically preserved and we just discovered them today, we wouldn't know they were the original. We'd say, oh, here's an interesting variant of Paul's letter, blah, blah, blah. But we'd have no way of knowing that that's the original letter. Again, it's fascinating. It's bizarre. And Christians have no idea just how dodgy their own scriptural evidence is. And that's not even getting into what Bart talks about, the forgery and counter forgery and the orthodox corruption of scriptures, where Christians were perfectly at home with, oh no, Jesus didn't say that. He must have said this, and changing it. And all the textual fights.
Jesus knelt down and wrote in the sand, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," that edition.
Well, that whole story, actually, that whole little parable about that happening doesn't appear in our oldest manuscripts. Like those ones I talked about just now, that doesn't come for hundreds of years later. So we know for a fact that scene, it's one of Christians' most favorite scene about the real Jesus, was invented later.
By a monk in a monastery.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So the next one was eyewitnesses, that the Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
What about Paul? He was an eyewitness, right?
Well, even the Gospel, even the book of Acts says that he never saw Jesus, and he never says that he saw Jesus. And Paul loves to talk about Paul, but one story he never tells us is that I was walking on the road to Damascus and Jesus appeared to me and I fell down and was blind. He tells us nothing remotely like that story. Luke tells it 3 times, and each time he tells it, it doesn't quite add up. It's like there's some inconsistencies, but Paul never tells anything remotely like that. Yeah, and Paul loves to talk about Paul. So
how do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John didn't actually write the Gospels? What is, because it seems like they had their names are on it. Come on.
Right. And it's funny because all of them originally are anonymous. None of them says, I so-and-so wrote this, blah, blah, blah. In fact, Luke is the only one who's even pretending to write a historical book and not just a sermon, basically. Which is a lie, because he starts his book by saying, so many people are writing Gospels now. It seemed a good idea that I should go out and check out the story as it's come down to our generation and give you the. And then he steals Mark's stories and Matthew's stories, and we're left with. And so he's in step with Mark, or he's going off in his direction. So Gospels. I'm getting an alert that we're having connected issues. Do you need me to say any of that?
No, it's sticking at 7 and 8, so it's all right. It's doing okay, a little fluttery, but doing fine for now.
Okay, awesome. If you need me to repeat anything, just let me know and I will.
Yeah,
otherwise, we'll figure this all get edited out and post and be beautiful.
Post. This is live. There's no post.
No.
But yeah, so the reason we can conclude the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses, even if they weren't,
they don't claim to be. They don't claim to be, and the things that they describe, when they're not totally allegorical, they just don't make sense historically, and they don't corroborate each other in large degrees. They're either in lockstep with the basic story of Mark, or they're going off in their own direction. And they're all acting, none of them set out to write the gospel according to this guy, the gospel according to that guy. They were all of them setting out to write the one true gospel. We're lucky we still have the book of Mark, because it was what they used, and then they meant for it to be discarded. And like, there's extra canonical gospels like the Gospel of Peter that no one's heard of today. And yet in their time, they were way more popular than Mark, because they had things like a 500-foot tall Jesus who comes out of the tomb, and a talking cross that comes out of the tomb. It's like that gospel rocked in the 2nd century. And yet it didn't make the final cut.
Gotcha. And so the next one is Josephus. Josephus mentioned Jesus, didn't he?
Yeah. So Flavius Josephus was this 1st century Jewish historian. And basically, much of what we know about 1st century Judaism and the Jewish war with Rome comes directly from Flavius Josephus. So it makes sense that early Christian writers would love him, and they did, and that was one of the big books that he'd read, that they would read, was his. But for the first 500, let me back up because I'm getting ahead of myself. So Christians today say that, oh yeah, Josephus, he mentions Jesus in 2 places. There's one commercial for Jesus, basically. They call it the Testimonium Flavinianum, where in the middle of talking about something else completely, he says, oh, and there was about this time a guy named Jesus who was really great, and all his followers who loved him to this day, still love him to this day, and a tribe of Christians so named after him is awesome. And our chief men, because it's a Jew writing this, crucified him, but he was clearly the Son of God because he did all these miraculous things. It's like, there's no way, and there's no one who argues that that's a real thing that Josephus said. It's obviously something a Christian made up. What the argument has become is that they are so desperate for corroboration with the Gospels, the Christians say, well, Josephus probably wrote something about Jesus, and the Christians messed it up later. And it's like, well, the fact that any of it is a forgery, that's a hit and a half that you really shouldn't be leaning on it too heavily. But nonetheless, they do. And the goalposts have been moved such that it's like, oh, no, I'm sure he must have said something about Jesus, even though that's all they can really hang their hat on, is that it has the word Jesus on it. And again, I spent a whole chapter talking about this because I think if there's a historical evidence for Jesus, it's important talking about it. But one of the first things I say out of the book in Nailed is that all these people, and there's like 50 people that get trotted out by pastors saying, these are witnesses to Jesus. Here's a witness to Jesus, eyewitness to Jesus. None of them are eyewitnesses to Jesus. Flavius Josephus lived after Jesus was even born and died, allegedly. And he's writing at the end of the 1st century. And his thing that he wrote is clearly a forgery. We even have a really good idea of who did the forgery, because for 500 years, no one seems to know about this little passage in Josephus except this one guy. And for 500 years after him, no one knows about it either, until Jerome. And so even the guy that he got his copy of Josephus from complains that Josephus never mentions Jesus. So it's like there's multiple reasons to realize that this was not a real thing at all. Not even a reverbed, rebooted thing. It's a forgery right from the get-go.
You mentioned
There's
there were
another
2
passage.
passages. Yeah.
Yes, the second passage is called the so-called James passage, because he mentions about a Christian leader. Actually, I'm not sure if he mentions he's a Christian or not, but anyway, the sect leader, Jacob/James, who was the brother of Christ, and talks about how he was killed by the Jews and how it caused this huge uproar. And the story makes no sense if it's about a Christian leader. Nothing in that story makes any sense historically at all. And if you read the story, it tells you who it's talking about. It's talking about a guy named Jesus, son of Dabnius, the high priest. And then it's like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense if that's who we're talking about. But the passage, it's not even a complete forgery. It looks like some monk took a correcting note, the side note, a liner note that says, James, the brother of Jesus, and somebody put who was called the Christ and stuck that in there. A correction note that made its way in the text. And we see that happening all times in the ancient world. That's a very common scribal mistake to make. And we have all kinds of copies, not just Christianity, but pagan ones that do the same thing. And again, the story makes no sense if it was about anybody who was supposed to be the brother of the Lord, let alone a Christian leader. It makes perfect sense if it's about who the story says it's about in the first place. Yeah.
Gotcha. So the next one was wildly famous, but nobody cared.
Yeah. It's so funny to me. Like, it goes back to that first thing. It's like, oh, no, Jesus, that's ridiculous because we have all this information about him. And it's like, except we don't. We really don't. And it all starts with the Christians, not with Jesus. And all those, I'm talking about those 50 or so guys who are trotted out as eyewitnesses to Jesus. Not only are none of them eyewitnesses, not only are none of them alive during the time of Jesus, but they're all talking about Christians. It's like, no one's saying there weren't Christians in the 2nd century or the late 1st century. But that doesn't mean Jesus was a real dude, and we see all the weird. We can see the traces of all the different kinds of Christianities there were before the Gospels were written.
So when Christians say that Jesus was wildly famous, are they referring to like the feeding of the 500? So there must have been a lot of people who knew him at the time.
Not just that, but also the fact that his fame spread to Judea and to the Decapolis and Syria. It's like the Gospels and the Book of Acts have wildly exaggerated stories about Christianity being super popular. Luke loves to bring in celebrities from the first century and put them as part of his story. So he has Paul appearing before these famous celebrity couples of the first century, and the things that happen in there are hilarious, as not a parody exactly, but they're if you're familiar with those characters at all, what Paul does in them is hilarious and funny, because like for instance, he goes before Berenice and Herod, one of Herod's nephews, and gives him a speech about being sexually pure because the guy married his niece. Berenice, his wife, is also his niece. So and he likes putting like famous Jews like Gamaliel in to booster the appeal. Luke was very much a big tent guy. He wanted to bring in all the people. So he has a Pharisee telling the disciples, you're telling the Sanhedrin, let's be careful with these guys because they might be the real deal. Something a Pharisee never would have said, and he's referring to things that happened out of time. There's anachronisms, like he never could have said that because that hadn't happened yet. So it's all the mistakes that Luke makes when he's writing his history not only shows us who he's borrowing from, and a lot of it's from Josephus, but that he's the one stealing because he doesn't always get it right, and he makes mistakes, and he copies things down in the exact arbitrary order that Josephus gives us to us, which is weird unless he was copying from Josephus.
Gotcha. And the last one, myth vision is ridiculous. Also, there's a chat from the audience. The same question, essentially. From Wikipedia, virtually all scholars of antiquity accept that Jesus was a historical figure. What makes them all wrong?
Wait, Wikipedia said that? Oh my goodness, I must be wrong. It's like, that's the worst argument you can make, because 30 years ago, virtually all scholars of antiquity said that Moses was real. 100 years before that, all of them were sure that Adam and Eve were real. The field of biblical studies is littered with this, oh, well, yeah, that's all allegorical, of course, obviously, oh, this is all a deep theological metaphor, obviously. And it's just been creeping up toward Jesus. Now it's Jesus's turn to examine that. And again, I mentioned this earlier, and this happens in Richard Carrier's book, Proving History. Biblical scholars, let me back up even further. When you look at who the biblical scholars are, for starters, the vast majority of them are Christians or religious figures of some, adherents of some sort or not. The institutions that they work at are religious for the most part, because more and more religious studies and Jesus studies is dying out in secular academia. And that situation's only getting worse for atheists. It's not getting better. In Jesus Mything in Action, I actually did not a survey, but I actually, not just a survey, but a census of all the schools in America that offer any kind of New Testament Jesus studies, any kind of relevant historical data on the Jesus in early Christianity. And all I wanted to find out was, do you have your scholars and students sign a statement of faith saying, we believe in Christianity, we always believe in Christianity, Christianity is always, always, always true? And is that a requirement of teaching Bible studies in your school? Not only did the majority say, yeah, you have to do that. You have to toe the theological line to teach it here. But a considerable chunk of them either lied about that, and we found out later they did have to sign a statement of faith, or they refused to answer about that. So the question isn't just why are biblical scholars denying mythicism. It's how many of them are contractually obligated to deny mythicism or any other thing that steps on toes of Christianity. And in Jesus Myth in Action, I actually do a whole list of case studies of not atheists, well, not secular, but Christian biblical study scholars who have gotten in hot water for suggesting things not anywhere as radical as that. Like, for instance, I'm forgetting who it was. I want to say it was, well, anyway, he said that, oh, that scene in Matthew where all the dead Jewish saints come out of their tomb and appear to everyone, wondering that zombie apocalypse happening in Matthew. He suggests, well, maybe that's just apocalyptic language. And they went to pieces for that, suggesting that maybe that's just a metaphor. Yeah. And another one's like Thomas Thompson, his career almost ended 30 years ago, now closer to 40 years ago, I guess, for suggesting that Moses and the patriarchs weren't actual real historical figures. And now, at least in Europe, if not all of major biblical studies, that is the consensus now. That's not even a weird fringe theory. That's the consensus. And it's going to happen that way with Jesus if there's any logic to be had. But then again, as a Christian, you can finagle if evolution is true. You can work around that. If Adam's just a metaphor, you can work around that. Moses, that stings a little, but you could work around that. But Jesus, if Jesus isn't real, that's kryptonite for Christianity. And so I think that's why they drag their heels about Josephus, for instance, because you take out those two references in Josephus, and there's not even no eyewitnesses to Jesus. There's no one in the first 100 years of Christianity to offer any sort of a corroboration. Again, we don't need Jesus to be a myth. They need Jesus not to be a myth. And whichever side wins out, if it turns out I'm all wrong and there was a real Jesus and we can know anything solid about him, that's still not going to help their Jesus of faith. The real Jesus, the historical Jesus, no matter how you slice it, it debunks Christianity. And that alone is why I think having the debate is worth it. Because again, all the back and forth between what we know about Jesus, what we can know about Jesus, points out that, you know what, there's not a lot we can know about him, whether he was real or not, whether Christianity is real or not. You have to take it on faith because it's not adding up on this end.
For sure. As a last note, if you do have time, I'd like you to check out the Shakespeare mythicist stuff and see how that fits in, because on your new book where you're saying that there's a lot of parallels between different religious leaders and how the stories grow,
Yeah.
I'd like to see if there's a parallel between Shakespeare and other historical figures who are claimed to have a similar kind of mythical backdrop, and hear your thoughts and comparisons between
And I will do that.
one.
I have done on other ancient figures like Aesop, like Pythagoras, like Polonius of Tiana. And there is a very interesting, you see the development happen in the same way that you see for like Jesus. But yeah, you could bring it up like William Tell of Switzerland, Ned Ludd, the Luddite army who led the Luddites in Britain. These are all people who seem on the face of it, to be real characters, and yet no, 100% made up. And so there's analogies even to be had today, even today with QAnon. It's like you ask who QAnon is, and they don't say, oh, these two guys in the Philippines made him up. They say, oh no, he's an insider in the White House and blah blah blah, and he sent me, and that's why January 6th happening. So all these mythical myth-making processes are still alive and well. Yeah,
Absolutely.
but yeah, I will check that out. Yeah.
Please do, and let me know if you have any thoughts on that. Send me your thoughts, because I'm definitely interested in hearing your perspective, because they have some really interesting arguments. Like the William of Staffordshire couldn't write; he was illiterate, so he couldn't have possibly have been Shakespeare. And
Same thing they said about Muhammad, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah, and Joseph Smith, they said claimed him too as well. Yeah,
so,
it's interesting. That's might be a bigger chunk to bite off than I'm ready for this book, because I'm really eager for this book to come out. But I definitely will be mentioning that for sure.
Awesome.
Sure.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Also, thanks again for coming on. It's been about an hour and 20 minutes. Really appreciate it. Do you want to give any links or references, or where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, sure. I've got a website, davidfitzgerald.org. Mostly people seem to find me on Facebook, and that's the easiest way to do it. You can also shoot me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com. And I don't want to debate your Christian uncle about whether there was a Jesus or not, but I'm happy to talk about anybody, atheist or who thinks there was a Jesus or wonders why anyone would think there was no Jesus.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too, Tom. Thanks again. Take care, all.
Bye-bye.